My dad erased every trace of my late mother from our house until I made sure he'd never forget her again. After my mother died from cancer when I was 14, my father turned our home into a shrine to forget. He started with reasonable things like donating her clothes and boxing up jewelry, but within 6 months he was burning her handwritten recipes and forbidding us from speaking her name. The worst part was how thorough he was. When I hung her photo in my room, he waited until I was at school, then threw it in the garbage while I watched helplessly on our security app. When I wore her necklace to my piano recital, he ripped it off my neck in the parking lot and dropped it down a storm drain. When relatives called on her birthday, he'd hang up and block their numbers. When the cemetery sent a reminder about her headstone maintenance, he threw it unopened in the trash saying the dead don't need maintenance. He even hired someone to Photoshop her out of family photos, leaving creepy empty spaces where she used to stand. The night everything changed started when my boyfriend surprised me after work with a first edition of my mother's favorite poetry book. We were sitting at the kitchen table as I opened the worn cover, telling him how she'd read it to me every night before bed. My father appeared in the doorway like he'd been summoned, his face shifting from calm to rage in seconds. "What is that?" He crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched the book from my hands. My boyfriend tried to explain it was just poetry, that he thought I'd like it, but my father cut him off. "You thought wrong." He ripped the book in half down the spine with one violent motion, then again and again until century-old pages fluttered to the floor like dying birds. I sat frozen in shock as my father gathered the pieces and dumped them in the kitchen trash, pouring leftover coffee over them for good measure. He turned to my boyfriend with cold satisfaction and said, "Next time you'll know better than to bring the dead into my house." Watching him destroy the last piece of her that could have been mine, something inside me finally snapped. That's when I decided to teach him what it meant to be haunted. I left that night and went straight to my grandmother's house, the one person who'd refused to let my father erase her daughter. She was a funeral director who'd spent 30 years helping families grieve, and when I told her about the destroyed book and years of systematic erasure, her professional composure cracked. She immediately called her 2 sisters who were both grief counselors, and within an hour they sat in her living room listening to every detail. They'd been banned from our house since the funeral when they'd insisted on displaying Mom's photos, and now they finally understood the full scope of what my father had done. They exchanged looks that promised retribution, and my grandmother said simply, "Your mother deserves to be remembered." I told them about his Sunday church service, how he sat in the front row every week maintaining his image as the grieving widower, how he'd be trapped there with the entire congregation watching. Sunday morning I watched from across the street as he walked into church wearing his best suit, settling into his usual front pew. 10 minutes into the service, my grandmother and her sisters entered through the side door in full funeral director attire. The pastor paused mid-sermon as they walked to the front carrying flower arrangements and a large portrait of my mother. The congregation gasped and whispered as my grandmother announced they were here to conduct the memorial service that had been denied 2 years ago. My father shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "Get out of here," he shouted, but they continued setting up displays while her sisters handed out memorial programs to the shocked congregation. The youngest aunt began reading the eulogy my father had forbidden, and he lunged toward her, trying to grab the papers from her hands. 2 deacons immediately stepped forward and grabbed his arms, holding him back as he struggled and screamed about this being his church. Her favorite hymn began playing from speakers they'd brought, and several congregation members who'd known her started crying while my father thrashed against the men restraining him. "Stop this," he roared, but the deacons forced him back into the pew and held him there. The pastor, who'd been told the truth beforehand, simply nodded for them to continue. They finished the service by inviting everyone to share memories of my mother, and person after person stood up to speak, while my father sat pinned between 2 large men, forced to listen to 40 minutes of stories about the woman he'd tried to erase. I moved out that night while he sat in his empty house, shunned by the congregation who finally saw his true nature. Now every Sunday he walks past her memorial plaque alone, the widower who tried to bury his wife twice.